Hello, welcome to this online lecture. Today we will be discussing about the logical positivist view on the method of science. This particular topic is covered in the papers called Philosophy of Science as well as the Philosophy of Language in PG Second Year Philosophy. The main objective of this lecture is to introduce you to the pre-20th century discussions regarding the nature of science. Further, it exposes you to the basic ideas of an influential view called positivism, which exercised and still exercises a great deal of influence. And the objective of this lecture is to clear the ground for a detailed discussions regarding this method of science. And this whole discussions of this lecture, confined with some key points like the basic difference between philosophy and science, and we can discuss about the historical expositions of science. Then we will discuss about how the logical positivists they have explained, they have discussed the method of science. By taking this the method of science, the logical positivist they confine with the basic points like the principle of verifiability, the confirmation, and the elimination of metaphysics. Later on, these logical positivists they have been criticized by the post-positivist by by pointing out the points like the basic points like the objectivity, the rationality, and the progress of science. Again, they have they have identified there are paradoxes in the principle of confirmation. That is called the paradoxes of confirmations. Coming to this whole discussions, we have to go one by one. First, the difference between philosophy and science. If we talk about this, the difference between philosophy of science, there is no sharp dividing line between philosophy and science. Both in principle, they are universal in subject matter, and and both aim at the truth. However, though there is no sharp dividing line between philosophy and science, there are important differences in in method, in presuppositions, as well as in style. Philosophical problems tends to have three different features by which they have been differentiated from science, or scientific problems do not have. What are those? First, philosophy is a large part concerned with the questions that we have not yet found a satisfactory or a systematic way to answer it. Secondly, the philosophical problems tends to have the larger framework rather than a specific questions within the framework, which science does. And the third one is the philosophical questions are typically concerned with the conceptual issues. That means they are often questions about our concepts and the relations between our concepts and the world they represent. So these are the basic criteria through which science has been different from, so philosophy has been different from science. And we'll be very clear if we'll give some examples on the difference between philosophy and science. The questions like, what is the cause of cancer is a scientific question, it's a scientific statement rather than a philosophical. Again, if we'll say what is the nature of causation, this particular question is a philosophical question, it's not a scientific question. Similarly, if we'll say the questions like you know, how many neurotransmitters are there? This particular question is a scientific question. It's not a philosophical question. The questions like what is the relationship between mind and body? This particular question is a philosophical question rather than scientific. See, these are the basic differences by which, these are the basic points by which we can differentiate philosophy and science. See, by discussing about the whole method of science or science in general, science has not only shaped uh, our mode of living in the world, but it also you know, but it also uh, shape the ways of thinking about this world. It is for this reason science has acquired a central place in the intellectual life of our time. Because of this centrality in the modern science, in modern culture, three different disciplines have been emerged. What are those? And they are history of science, sociology of science, and philosophy of science. Now, history of science deals with the development of scientific ideas and institutions in chronological order. And sociology of science is the study of the relationship between social factor and forces on the one hand and the growth of scientific ideas and institutions on the other hand. In very short, we can say there is an inquiry into the relationship between science and society. Then coming to this, the last, discipline that is called philosophy of science. And the philosophy of science is the study of science as a cognitive enterprise. Then what does it mean, cognitive enterprise, quote unquote? A cognitive enterprise means, is a knowledge seeking activity. The inquiry which we call philosophy of science addresses the questions like what is the aim of science, what is the method of science, in what sense science is objective, science is rational, and scientific progress. That means philosophy of science deals with the questions of objectivity, rationality, and the progress of science. Coming to this historical expositions about this method of science, the word science came to be used very late in the beginning of the 19th century. The inquiry which we call science today is quite old. Hence, it is not surprising that the questions like what is the aim of science and what is the method of science. These two questions, the aim and method of science, have a long history. Aristotle tries to answer these two questions, the aim and method of science. And the way he answers these two questions and his philosophy of science, it has a tremendous influence till the end of 16th century. In fact, till the end of 16th century, Aristotle's philosophy of science was considered the philosophy of science. And the point is, why Aristotle's philosophy of science was considered the philosophy of science? No, in science, what Aristotle explained or how Aristotle explained these questions, according to him, in science, we start with particular observations regarding what is the case. Now, using this method of induction, we can arrive at definition, which are the statements about the essential nature of the things. Suppose how it is possible. Now, by using this method of induction, that means we are basically dealing with or we are confined with particular instances. By taking the limited number of instances, we try to draw the conclusions. And that sort of thing is called definition, the essential nature of the things, or sometimes you can call, you know, the defining characteristics or the defining nature. And and by using this method of deduction, on the basis of definition, we can arrive at demonstration. That means how things must be and what they are. Suppose if we say in a deductive procedure or in a deductive argument, it consists three statements, like one of the statements, or you can say the premises, two premises and one conclusion. The one of the premise has to be a universal law statements or general statements or universal generalizations, and another premises has to be a conditional statements. By taking these two statements from the universal laws or universal generalization, and by taking simultaneously the initial conditions or the conditional statements, we can draw the conclusion. And that conclusion has to follow from the premises, and that is a direct process, right? And there is a necessary connection between the premises and the conclusion. So here we found two methods and two aims of science. The methods are deductive and inductive method, and the aims are definition and demonstration. See, this kind of answers which Aristotle has given, it has a tremendous influence till the end of 16th century. However, these questions, the aim and the method of science, again, again they were raised in the 17th century. And the 17th century philosophers, they tried to answer these two questions. By seeking to provide the new answers to these questions, 17th century philosophers, they worked out a new philosophy of science which would replace the traditional philosophy of science which was introduced by Aristotle. By answering these two questions, the 17th century philosophers they claim that they claim that the result itself give rise or give birth of the modern philosophy of science. In whole span of 3 centuries, from the beginning of the 17th century till the end of 19th century, two views turned out prominently by answer to these two questions, like what is the aim of science and what is the method of science. The 17th century philosophers, they answered these two questions like according to the inductivism and the hypothesism. According to inductivism, the method of science is called the method of induction, and the second view is called the method of hypothesis. That means the method of science is called the method of hypothesis. Right. Now, Francis Bacon is the father of hypothesis, is the father of inductivism, and René Descartes he claimed as the father of method of hypothesis. According to the modern science, according to inductivism, the hallmark of science is called, certainty and breadth. In what sense? How it is certainty and breadth? How there are certainty and breadth? Now that means from now on, science must aim at procuring a type of knowledge which on the one hand is definite and the other hand is more encompassing. That means in inductive arguments we are confined with the particular statements. That means we are sure and certain about the particular facts and sure and certain about the particular act of observations. By, by taking a limited number of instances, we are getting the conclusion. And the breadth is, the breadth is because we are taking the n number of instances. We are taking we are just taking a finite number of instances, and from which we are drawing the conclusion. And the whole structure is a lengthy process, so it is called breadth. And second thing is the aim of science. The aim of science is to arrive at laws that are established by universal, inductive generalization. Because by using this method of induction, we are getting the result, the conclusions, that is called the inductive generalization. That is by accumulation of established generalizations, which we call the laws. The point is why we are discussing all these things here. Right. Here, the question can be arise that the Aristotle also introduced the method of induction, and the modern philosophers also they use the method of induction. Whether they are talking about the same thing or not, whether they are talking about they are using the same procedures or not. There is a basic difference between Aristotle and the modern science by using this method of induction. What is the basic? What are those differences? The modern philosophers they are claiming that there is nothing called laws. There is nothing called laws in science. It is only irregularities, or it is only called generalizations. There is nothing called definition. It is, it's sometimes called as regularities. These are the basic difference between the Aristotle and the modern science by introducing or by using this method of induction. Next, coming to this second, second view, that is called hypothesism. Hypothesism, the hallmark of science is certainty. The hallmark of science is novelty and depth. That means by using this method of hypothesis, we are not dealing with any kind of particular facts. We are not confined with any kind of particular facts, but we are simply hypothesizing. We are simply imagining the facts and which are novel in sense. That means to say that science must aim at procuring a type of knowledge which is novel in the sense. It is not given to us in particular observations. Rather, such knowledge have depth in meaning, depth in the sense that realities lies behind what we observe. That is called depth. So by using these procedures, that the modern philosophers they have given two views, that is inductivism and hypothesism, and this has been explained in the method of science. Now the point is why we are discussing all these historical details. What is the use of by using the historical details? Now the intention behind providing all these historical details is to clear the ground for the discussions of the 20th century development of science, development of philosophy of science. And the first half of the 20th century philosophy of science was dominated by this positivist, and the second half of the 20th century philosophy of science was dominated by the post-positivist. Now we have to discuss what exactly how the positivist philosophy they have explained this method of science. Now, positivist is a movement, is a movement in philosophy science in the first half of the 20th century. Positivist philosophy, or sometimes we can call the logical positivist, also they can be called as, you know, neo-empiricist. The empiricist and the neo-empiricist. The logical positivists are, they are called as the neo-empiricist. How they are different from the empirical philosophers or empiricists? Now, empirical philosophers or empiricists in general, they try to, develop the ideas, right? But this is, this section of, schools like positivist philosophers or positivist philosophy, they are simply practicing, or they are simply using the ideas which the empirical philosophers they have developed. In that sense, they are quite different from empirical philosophers. And another sense also we can say the empirical philosophers or the empiricists, they are less conservative than these modern philosophers called the logical positivist. They have the basic differences. Now the logical positivist, they are called the logical positivist because they, they are in some sense, confined with the method of verification. They are talking about the factual knowledge, or they are basically dealing with the fact. Now the point is, by using this method, they are analyzing the fact, they are verifying the fact. According to logical positivist, a scientific statement or a statement is meaningful or meaningless by using this method of verification. That the meaningful or the meaningless of the statements depends upon the verifications. Suppose if you say there is a bottle in front of me. If I verify the fact, if it is there, then the statement like there is a bottle in front of me, quote unquote, it is true because it is verified. It's a fact. The fact of observation is the fact of verifications. And if I talk about this logical positivist, there are basic tenets of logical positivist by which they have been termed. And the logical positivist, they are, and they are trying to eliminate these metaphysical statements, and the metaphysical statements or the metaphysics in general, which is central to the philosophy, they are trying to eliminating, or they are trying to rejecting the metaphysics. Why they are trying to reject the metaphysics? Now the metaphysical statements, they are dealing with some kind of, they are dealing with kind of presuppositions. They are dealing with realities. They are talking about the realities. The metaphysical statements are spurious kind. So they are trying to eliminate the metaphysics. And more importantly, the metaphysical statements, they cannot be verified. Or metaphysical statements cannot be, cannot be observed, cannot be verified. So, according to the logical positivist, they claim that the metaphysical statements are meaningless. But metaphysical statements cannot be verified, but it has some meaning. Later on they have accepted it has some meaning. It cannot be verified. If it is not verified, if something is not verified, that doesn't mean that we simply reject or we simply claim that it is meaningless. So metaphysical statements are meaningful statements, but metaphysical statements are not verifiable in nature. So if we talk about this metaphysics, the metaphysics deals with the questions like what is the ultimate realities, what is mind, what is what is soul, what is God, if God exists, what is the justification for the existence of a God, if God exists, then how it is related to this phenomenal world. These sort of questions are dealing with metaphysics, or metaphysical problems are deals with these sort of questions. And the logical positivists, they are claiming that these metaphysical statements are meaningless statements. Why? And these metaphysical questions which are derived, it cannot be answered, or metaphysical problems cannot be solved. And that logical positivist, what they are claiming, they are saying that instead of giving the answer, or instead of giving answer to these metaphysical questions, or instead of analyzing these metaphysical problems, better to dissolve this metaphysics, or better to dissolve this metaphysical problems, because it cannot be answered. So there are the basic tenets of logical positivist. What are those basic tenets? Uh, First one is called scientism. What is that called scientism? Now, science is, according to logical positivist, science is qualitatively superior to ideal for all other human endeavors. That is called scientism. And second one is called methodological monism. That means in science, according to positivists, they claim there is only one method in science, that is called the method of verification. If we verify the fact, then we can give some sort of meaning about particular fact. And number three is there is only one method, that is called inductivism, and that inductivism is common to all sciences, irrespective of natural science, you can say human science, or you can say the social science. And the hallmark of science consists in the fact that they are systematically verified. And if we talk about this, the objectivity and the rationality and the progress of science, they have their special features. And the logical positivist, they are claiming that science is, science is objective because it is pure. In what sense science is objective? And they claim that science is pure in the sense that they are theory free, or they are theory independent. That means no theory is required. And in another sense, you will say how science is rational. Now, science is rational because we are using only one method in science, that is called principle of induction. And by using this principle of induction, why it's called rational? And by using this principle of induction, we are very much sure and certain about a particular fact. In that sense, science is rational. And coming to this, the progress of science. If you say science is progressive, that logical positivists, they are claiming that science is progressive because you know you know the progress of science means the development of scientific theories. If we'll say you know so let me explain that particular point. Suppose if we'll say like just 1 minute. Suppose we will say like it is a scientific theory T T they develops from T1, sorry, T1, T2, then T2 to T3. These are called the scientific, development of scientific theory. T1, then T2, then T3. These are the development of scientific theories. That is called progress. When we talk about this progress of science, what logical positivists they are claiming? The progress, from T1 and T2, the progress of science, that T1 and T2, they are completely different from each other. That means T1 is, T1, T1, the development of T2, that T1 plus something new equal to T2. Right. Likewise, they discuss about there is a continuous process. There is a continuous process between T1 and T2. Right. T1 plus something new T2, then T2 plus something new equal to T3. That means there is a continuous development, there is a continuous process between two theories. This is the progress of science, and the progress of science is a continuous process because it always holds with the old theory and something new. That is called the new theories. That means T1 from T1 to T2, that means T2 is always with T1 plus something new. Then there is a continuous process, or there is a continuity between two theories. This is called progress of science. Now coming to this, the principle of verifiability, how this principle of verifiability is taken. If we talk about this principle of verifiability, there are two different ways we can verify the fact. In a strong sense, in a strong sense of a verifiability and the weak sense of a verifiability. In the strong sense of a verifiability, it talks about a proposition is to be verified in a strong sense in the terms that if and only if its truth could be conclusively established in experience, or the strong sense of verifiability gives a conclusive result. That means there is no further discussion, there is no further development of science. The first, the end. And weak sense of verifiability, if we talk about the weak sense of verifiability, there is an experience to render it a probabilities. It is possible for experience to render it probable. That means there can be the chances of making it a new thing, or there can be chances of getting a new result. Suppose if you say, verifiability principle in a strong sense, suppose for example if you say arsenic is poisonous, or all metals expands when it is heated. These kind of statements are justified, or these kind of statements are verified in a strong sense. And suppose if you say, there are mountains in the further side of the moon. These kind of statements are sometimes called as verifiability in a weak sense, because we are not confirmed how many stars are there in our planet. But we take some we take some numbers. So far we have discovered, or so far we have it has been explored. But we may not claim, or we cannot claim that this is the end, or this much, the amount of stars are there in the planet. So this kind of statements also can be called as in a weak sense, because there is a possibility of the probability, there is a possibility of getting a new result. These kind of things are there. So these are the basic discussions in the principle of verifiability. Again, the principle of confirmability. There, the logical positivists, they are claiming that we are simply confirmed about this particular fact, the base in the superstructure, we are confirming about the fact, and the confirmation is always depend upon the principle of verifiability or principle of verification. Through verification, we can have confirmable particular fact. So, and the last point in a logical positivist, which I was supposed to discuss, that elimination metaphysics. Since already we have discussed this elimination metaphysics, that metaphysical logical positivist, they are claiming that metaphysical statements are not verified, and metaphysical problems also cannot be solved. So in order to solve these metaphysical problems, better to dissolve it, because we do not have any sort of result, or we do not have any kind of resultant, and so that we can expose it or we can put it here. Then these are the whole discussions about this, the method of science. In fact, more confined to the logical positivist view on method of science, and the objectivity of science, how this logical positivists they are claiming. Now they are claiming that the method of science is always shown to be pure. That means it is a theory independent rather than theory dependent. Why it is theory independent? Now, it is theory independent because if you introduce any theories, or if you use any sort of theories, then it won't be in objective, rather it would be in a subjective manner, which is not the whole the base tenets of logical positivist. Sorry. Now coming to this point, what are the basic criticisms how logical positivist has been criticized by the post-positivist. If we talk about the main discussions like the objectivity, the rationality, and the progress of science of logical positivism or logical positivist philosophy, they have been criticized on the basis of objectivity, rationality, and the progress of science. How? Now, those who have criticized logical positivist, they are claiming that in coming to this objectivity, the logical positivist has been criticized by the post-positivist, particularly Karl Popper. Karl Popper, he has criticized, positivist that, or post-positivist in general, you can say that science is objective because it is theory dependent rather than theory independent. Why it is theory independent? Now it is theory dependent because in science there is nothing called finite, or in science there is nothing called final. If there is something called final, then there is the progress of science will remain in questions. Science is always in progressing. Science is always in a continuous process of development. So we cannot claim something to be final, right? It's a kind of regularities. It's a kind of general process of development. In that sense, the post-positivist, particularly Popper, Popper is criticizing these positivist ideas. See, in some sense, we can know that Popper is he's a positivist philosopher. But when Popper he was asked, are you a positivist philosophy? Popper is discussed in his biography, that is Unended Quest. It's a beautiful book. If you will go through that book, there one of his chapters he has discussed that who kills positivism. There he tried to analyze that he accepts some of ideas of positivist philosophy, but he himself never claims he is a positivist. Right? Like what kind of things? If you say the objectivity, rationality, and the progress, maybe there are different ideas or different analysis, but the rejection of metaphysics, which he never accepts, because Popper is in some sense is a realist rather than a positivist. right? Means logical positivist, they are anti-realist. Why they are called anti-realist? Because they do not believe any kind of realities, or they do not accept any sort of ultimate realities, because the ultimate realities they do not verify it, right? Or we cannot verify these realities. Likewise, they do not accept the concept of reality, where they have discussed in the rejection from metaphysics. Our whole rejection from metaphysics is dealing with this sort of discussions. And coming to the second criticism, which post-positivists they are claiming that science is rational. Now, post-positivists they are claiming that science is rational because positivists they are claiming that science is rational because they are using the one principle, that is called principle of induction. Because in principle of induction we are verifying the fact, and the facts are being rationally justified, or the facts are being rationally judged. In that sense, they claim it is a rational kind of justifications. But those who have criticized positivist philosophy in rationality of science, particularly post-positivist, they are claiming that science, the rationality of science is always depends upon the intersubjectivity discussions, rather than it's kind of one-dimensional. It should be intersubjective discussions. Why it is an intersubjective discussion? Now they claim that if it is an intersubjective discussions, we can develop new ideas, or we can introduce new facts, or we can analyze new things. So the progress of science always based on new sort of things. If it is confined to only one thing, it's very difficult to come up with other things, or it is to proceed further. These are basic difference between positivist and that is a lacuna with positivist philosophy. And coming to this, the progress of science, the progress of science, according to the logical positivist, they are claiming that is a continuity of science. But those who have criticized this, the progress of science, particularly post-positivist, and they are claiming the progress of science is not a continuous process. It is a discontinuous process. That means the progress of science means the development of scientific theories or the development of scientific ideas. So since a theory has been developed, or once a new theory has been developed, that means the old theory and the new theory, they are complete from different from each other. That means the new theory has nothing to do with this old theory. New theory means is completely new. It has nothing to do with old theory. Likewise, these two theories, they are completely different from each other. So they are being criticized in that way. So these are the basic discussions in positivist philosophy of science. And second, and the main part, the main discussions are with this, that post-positivist or some of the post-positivist philosophers, they analyze the paradox of confirmations, the conformability, the concept of conformability that has been used or that has been introduced by the positivist philosophy, because they are confirmed about particular fact. Through by principle of verification, we can confirm about the fact, and we are confirmed about the fact because it has some sort of meaning. It is meaningful statements, and it is different from the meaningless statements. But the point is, there is a paradox of a confirmation which is which is central to this post-positivist discussions. What is the paradox of confirmations? Then before discussing about this paradox of confirmations, we have to be very clear about what exactly paradox means. Now, paradox means a sequence of claim that if they are taken in isolation from each other, they seems to be reasonable, they seems to be sound enough. And if those claims are taken together, that makes confusion, or that makes paradoxical situations. Now the point is, what kind of paradoxes are there, or what kind of paradox is there in the theory of confirmation? Now, if we talk about this paradox of confirmation, sometimes it is called as Raven's paradox, because this particular concept and paradox of confirmation has been used by Carl G. Hempel, C. G. Hempel. So it can be called as Hempel's paradox, or it can be called as the paradox of a confirmation, or it can be called as the Raven's paradox. Why it is called Raven's paradox? Now, Hempel has taken the example. Hempel has trying to explain the paradox of confirmation by taking the help of an example called Raven's. How, what kind of, how or where there is paradox. Now, it's very important that, by illustrating this, paradox of confirmation, Hempel has taken an example called, suppose all rabbins are paradox, all rabbins are black, all rabbins are black. Now, there are three intuitively compelling principles by which there are three compelling principles of a confirmations which cannot be jointly satisfied. There are, keep in mind, there are three compelling principles of a confirmations which are not jointly satisfied. Hence, there is paradox. Now we have to discuss. Now we can discuss what are these three compelling principles of confirmations. Now, first one is called. Let me discuss, or let me explain in this particular discussions that one is called Nichols condition. Nichols condition. Now, what exactly Nichols condition talks about? Now, a universal generalization is confirmed by the positive instances. A universal generalization is confirmed by the observation, the positive instances. A universal generalization is confirmed by its positive instances. For example, suppose all ravens are black. All ravens are black. This particular statement is confirmed by the observation of black ravens. This is first condition. That is called Nichols condition. Right? A universal generalization is confirmed by its positive instances. That is, all ravens are black is confirmed by the observation of black ravens. This is first condition. Second is principle of relevance. Principle of equivalence. Principle of equivalence. What this particular principle talks about? Now this particular principle talks about if a piece of evidence confirms a hypothesis, it also it also confirms its logically equivalent hypothesis. If a piece of evidence confirms a hypothesis, it also confirms its logically equivalent hypothesis. Right? Logically equivalent hypothesis. And the number 3 is called the principle of relevant empirical investigations. Principle of relevant empirical investigations. Now this particular principle talks about hypotheses are confirmed by its positive hypotheses are confirmed by investigating what they assert. Hypotheses are confirmed by investigating what they assert. So these are the 3 intuitive principles by taking these 3 principles, Hempel tries to analyze the paradox of confirmations. Then now the real problem will start. Where there is a confirm, where there is paradox, right? Now, suppose take the hypothesis called H. That is, all ravens are black. Right? Take another hypothesis called all non-black things are non-ravens. H dash. Right? Now, according to this, right? Now, H and H dash, they are logically equivalent. H and H dash, they are logically equivalent. Right? How? Now, a positive instances of H all ravens are black and H dash is all non-black things are non-ravens. Okay, take for an example of H dash, that all non-black things are non-ravens. Suppose a white piece of chalk. Example of H dash, a white piece of chalk. Right? Since H and H dash, they are logically equivalent. That means all ravens are black and all non-black things are non-ravens. That means we have taken an example called a white piece of chalk. Right? Here by the Nichols condition, that the observation of a white piece of chalk confirms H dash. That means a white piece of chalk, it confirms H dash. Right? A white piece of chalk according to Nichols condition. What it talks about? A universal generalization is confirmed by its positive instances. That a universal generalization is confirmed by its positive instances. That means H dash, that all non-black things are non-ravens. This is the positive instance of H dash. a white piece of chalk. Positive instance of H dash. Right. That means this positive instance of H dash, this particular examples confirms H dash. Right. And hence, according to the principle, principle of equivalence, as we know that H and H dash, they are logically equivalent. So this particular positive instance confirms H. Right. Let me clear again. Just keep in mind. Right. Take for an hypothesis that is called H. All ravens are black. Take another hypothesis that is called H dash. That is called all non-black things are non-ravens. The positive instance of H dash is called a white piece of chalk. That means a white piece of chalk confirms H dash according to this first condition, Nichols condition. And according to the second principle, that principle of equivalence, now we can see that H and H dash, they are logically equivalent. Right? And since this particular example or this particular instance, since it confirms H dash, and now if H and H dash, they are logically equivalent, so this particular example confirms H. Clear? Right. Now the point is, in condition 3, the principle of relevant empirical investigation, here the problem arises. How here the problem arises? Here the problem arises because principle of relevant empirical investigations, that means all ravens are black, it has to be confirmed if we will verify the fact of black ravens. All ravens are black, it is verified by the observation of black ravens. But here the problem is, all ravens are black is verified not taking the black ravens, but we are taking a irrelevant things like a white piece of chalk. Since a irrelevant things confirms a general statement, there is the paradox. All the things are logically correct, they are sound enough, they are all reasonable. If we discuss it independently, then they are, if we discuss it in isolation, they are all sound enough and they are all reasonable. But when we combine, or when we take all these principles together, then the problem arises, or then paradox arises. Because we are confirming about a general statements by the help of a irrelevant things. That is the problem with confirmation. These are the paradox. Why it is called paradox? Why cannot it be called the problem for this confirmation? And this is paradox because all the principles which we have taken here, they are equally relevant, they are equally reasonable, they are equally justified, but all these principles we cannot jointly taken together. If we take jointly together, then there will be paradox. So these are the basic problems which has been discussed by these post-positivist philosophers. Okay, thank you.